Good morning, church. My name's Eryn, and I'm glad to be here with you. If you don't know me, like I said, I'm Eryn Black. My wife Elizabeth and I attend here regularly. We also both work full time as missionaries with Jews for Jesus. So we live only about 10 blocks from here and work in the city, mostly in Manhattan. We just got finished moving our building. It was in Midtown on 31st between Lex and Park, and we this week just finished moving everything to the West Village. So our building there is going to be, kind of up and running. And actually, if anybody ever wants to come see it, let me know. That would be cool. Drop by, we can grab a cup of coffee, and I'll show you the new space. So I'm going to be speaking today. Actually, my wife is speaking next week. So this is kind of this is the first of a little mini series. We're going to be talking about identity. And so what I wanted to talk about today was the question of identity as followers of Jesus. What does that mean for us? And especially, what does it mean to identify with Jesus, to find our identity in him, when sometimes Jesus seems to be asking his followers, both, the people who were literally there with him at the time, that the Bible is describing these events, and followers today, like us. What do we do when sometimes Jesus is asking his followers to do things or act in a way that seems strange or difficult or uncomfortable, or like it would make us seem weak? And that's what I want to talk about today. And I think this passage from Matthew really helps illustrate how there are things about the way of Jesus that can be uncomfortable for us to try and adopt, and it can be difficult to figure out, what does this really mean for me? So I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but in my time in New York, I have noticed that New York as a city is not necessarily a hospitable environment for weakness or perceived weakness. It can be a very busy place, kind of a tough place, an ambitious place. And it's the kind of city where if you're not just ready to be exhausted and frustrated and get aggressive and let yourself get that hard outer layer, then maybe it's not going to be the place for you. The city is not hospitable to what we might think of as weakness. And also, New Yorkers don't respond well to weakness or that perceived weakness. Because we are, in adapting to our environment, we become rushed, and we might be impatient, or we might be aggressive. We're willing to be abrasive. Not necessarily because New Yorkers are all mean. I think that's kind of a misconception. But we're all very busy. We're all very purposeful. We've got somewhere to be. And when we see people who are like, oh gosh, looks like that person, they're not going to make it here, we don't necessarily respond well to that. I think part of why that is because when we see something that we identify as weakness in another person here, some of that reminds us or makes us, it challenges us to think wow, that could be me. If I let my resolve slip, or if I decided not to be quite as ambitious or quite as aggressive, I could be the one who's going, man, I think I've got to move to whatever. I'm not going to pick a place and make it seem insulting. I'll say, who knows? Move somewhere more calm. The suburbs. Let's just say the suburbs. I don't know. I've got to move to the suburbs. And sometimes I've encountered people who kind of see that as you know what? They just couldn't make it. It's not for everybody. And it's that sense of superiority. But it is for me. I didn't have to move out because I'm tough or whatever. I'm used to it. And that can be something that we like. We like to identify with strength. We don't want to identify with something that we see as weak. We want to be people who look at strength and say, you know what? Yeah, I think that's approximately what I'm like. I'm strong like that. When we see people achieve and it inspires us, we're not inspired just because oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad for them. Maybe you are glad for them, but part of the reason that stories of achievement and people overcoming great odds can be inspiring is because we want to do that. not just because we're happy for the person who did. We want to be strong like that. I was at a and this is a story that didn't make it to the first service. So this is some special content just for you guys at the second service. Last night I went to East River Park to see a concert. There was a free concert, and it was a band I really liked called the Mountain Goats, and so they were playing there, and it was wonderful. It was a lot of fun, and they have a song from a couple albums ago where one of the singer, the narrator of the song is talking about overcoming great odds. And he's got this line where he says, everybody's got their limits, but nobody's found mine. And that's like, when you hear that, that's something we're kind of like, yeah, I'd like to be like that. Yeah, sure, everybody, there's a thing that everybody, at this point, I can't do it. We haven't reached that for me yet. We would love that, like that's what we identify with. We want that kind of strength. I was talking to a friend earlier this week about why like comic books were important to me as a kid and why I think superhero movies still like connect with people today, kids and adults. And part of it might be like nostalgia and things like that, but part of it is because when we see this image, this story about like somebody who's so powerful, like you see like Superman who can he's bulletproof and he's super strong and he can fly and he's also like morally upright and he can use that great power that he has to help put his morals in place in the world, to like fight evil. We look at that and we think like, oh, there's something about that might represent my best self. Like when the person I want to be who can use all of my abilities to accomplish good and who's willing to stand up to bullies and to, whatever. That is something that we love. I think a lot of people might find it harder to identify with a character who's like, in any kind of story where like, this guy never catches a break. He's just totally beleaguered. This man or this woman, like they try and nothing quite works out the way they want to. That's not the story that we want to identify with and be like, wow, yeah, that sense of mild disappointment really rings true for me and my life. And if we're being honest, that's probably closer than for us identifying with superheroes. But I think the reason that we want to identify with the heroes is because even aspirationally, we want to be like, yes, I want that kind of strength in my life. I hope that represents what I do and what I make a stand for, and that I don't let other people or evil or whatever like get the better of me. So if that's something that resonates with me, what do I do when I'm looking at the story of Jesus in the Gospels and I encounter a passage like that in Matthew 5, where Jesus is not saying to his followers, now listen guys, I am you don't understand how powerful I actually am, and I'm gonna use that power to accomplish all of my goals, and if you're following me, you're gonna get in on that same winning streak. He's not saying that. He's saying something that actually looks like weakness or fragility. A lot of times we think of humility, like Jesus is talking about, as equaling weakness or even stupidity. Like maybe you're not smart enough to be less humble than that, because why would you let somebody take advantage of you? And so it's difficult for us to encounter these words of Jesus and say, if I'm supposed to identify with him, how can I do that when everything in me wants to say, you need to stand up for yourself. Don't let people see you as weak and small. How do we do that? So let's look at the words here of Jesus in Matthew. So the context here of Matthew 5, Jesus is giving his famous Sermon on the Mount, and he is addressing the crowds. He is starting to gather like people and gain attention, and he's already established these disciples that he is training, his closest followers. And I think that a lot of what we see here is kind of indicative of Jesus' ministry, because you've got Jesus not as an established teacher. He's not from any kind of like teaching priestly dynasty. Here's a guy who is a 30-year-old blue collar kind of like a freelance rabbi who shows up out of nowhere, and he's gathered his own couple of disciples who are also like working class guys, probably of the same age, like well past the point when they would have committed themselves to a life of study. So Jesus is already doing something kind of different than what people are used to from their teachers. And when he starts this whole passage in Matthew 5, he starts by saying, the very well-known, they're called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, things like that. And when he starts in on these blessings, I think it would be very easy for the crowd to hear that and go, yeah, I can get behind that. Blessed are the meek. Okay, well, I don't know if I love the idea of being meek, but what's that he said? Oh, they'll inherit the earth. Terrific. I'll go in for this kind of long game. I'll be meek now so I can inherit the earth. Oh, blessed are the peacemakers. Okay, all right. You know what? I don't know if that always represents me, but there's nothing wrong. Like, I like that. I'm okay with saying I would at least like to be a person who makes peace in the world around me. Great, I can get behind that. And then he starts saying, well, blessed are you when you are persecuted for my sake. And I think the crowd might okay, well, I'm not sure about that. I think the peacemaker thing sounded better, and it sounded more like virtuous. I don't know about being persecuted, but let's see where you're going with this. And then by this point, kind of deep into his address to the crowd, we now have him saying stuff that I'm sure so many people in his audience were like, okay, no thanks. I appreciate some of what you said. This is where I leave you. Let's read some of this. He says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth." This is a familiar part of the law, the Torah, for Jewish people. And not only that, this isn't unique simply to Jewish life and Jewish culture. This is one of the oldest kind of social civil laws that says if someone wrongs you, they should repay you, or you are allowed to you're allowed to take payment from them in a way that is similar to how you were wronged. That's basically what this is saying. So when he says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, his crowd is going to be going, yep, exactly. We know where you're going. And then he says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. There. Come again? Like, what was this? We're familiar with the law that you were stating. This part that you have kind of appended, this makes no sense. What are you talking about? And there are reasons why this might be confusing. Okay, when we hear an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I think sometimes, at least me, I won't speak for everybody here, when I have heard that applied nowadays, it's usually people stating that in a way that kind of sounds like vengeful. Like, I need to go out. If you struck me in the eye, I strike you in the eye. Like, that's fair, that's just. That's not necessarily what this law was originally trying to communicate. What this did, when God told the children of Israel, this is a law that you are going to use to govern your people. Okay, he's giving them the law after they leave Egypt, where they had been in slavery for several hundred years. So now he's leading them to the promised land where they're going to establish their own country, and he's giving them rules and standards so that they can live in a way that lines up with God. And so when he gives them this law, he's not saying, anytime somebody hurts you, you need to go out and get them back in the same way. What he's actually saying is, I am putting a top limit to what justice is going to look like. If someone strikes you in the eye, you don't get to go and burn down their home. You don't get to repay them in a way that goes so far beyond the offense that everybody's going to live in fear of ever wronging someone else in the community. So by establishing the top limit of what a punishment could look like, you're also laying the groundwork for mercy and justice. because there's some other things going on here. One is that this was a rule to be applied by the courts, by judges. This wasn't a rule that every private citizen could take into their own hands and say, well, this person hurt me, I'm going to go hurt them, and then that'll be that. Like, no, this was something when you bring your case to the judge, a judge would look at that and say, okay, well, this guy was responsible for the death of your ox, so he'll give you an ox. Like, that's fair. But he wouldn't say, like, okay, you get all of his livestock, because that would not be just, So that's what this law is doing. It was for the courts to apply, not for private citizens. And very often, when you look at ancient Hebrew like history, it's not applied literally in a lot of cases. This is just the example that's being used. It's not that anytime somebody hurts you, they get hurt in the same way. That's not what it is. So this is not supposed to be this barbaric thing where everybody is just hurting anyone who hurt them. It's helping to add structure to society so that people are held accountable for their actions, but not in a way that goes so above and beyond what the wrong was. So this is a great thing. I don't think it sounds like, when you look at it that way, it's not really like brutal or barbaric at all. I think it actually establishes a really good way that their society conducted itself in terms of accountability and repayment. And I think the people would understand that. Also, the people at this time, Jesus' audience, you're talking about not a people who are in charge of their own country. This law was also being applied when Israel was a sovereign nation with their own rulers, their own court systems. Now, you have this greatly diminished people group because of how some of the tribes had gone into exile and didn't come back and all this. So you've only got Israel now is represented by only a few tribes. They're still in Judea, but it is occupied by foreign powers. They are like an oppressed minority group. So I think when Jesus starts this and says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, people are like, yeah, where's he going with this? And then when he talks about, don't resist this evil person. If they try to hit you on your right cheek, turn the left one to them too. This is shocking, but part of what he's doing is saying, guys, we don't have the system in place for you to live by this law. Because it wasn't for the private citizen, it was for the country. And he's saying, we just don't have that. The world that this came into is not your reality right now. So then what do? You don't have that kingdom. How do you live now in this one? And what he's starting to tell them, what he's proposing is that he is bringing a different kingdom that they can identify with, that they can join. And he's explaining the way of life in his kingdom. So instead of resisting this evil person, practice compassion and humility, which still sounds crazy. I know that doesn't explain how this is not weak or completely counterintuitive. Well, one of the things, the word resist in that verse, in the Greek, what that's actually talking about, it's not just saying like, you should never resist anything bad. It's talking about an attitude of readiness for battle. It's not just like the word resist, I think is much weaker a translation than what this really means. It's talking about an attitude where you are ready for battle. So what Jesus is suggesting is, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, we get it. You can go and you can take what is rightfully yours from the person who has wronged you. I am ready to be repaid. I am ready to hold them accountable. And what he's saying is, instead of being ready for battle, what if you were ready for forgiveness? What if you were ready to be compassionate? Ready to be perceived as weak? And so that's where we have him saying this idea of someone hitting you, insulting you. What if instead of fighting that person, you were willing to let it go? Let's go on to the next verse. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Here now we're talking about, the courts. if somebody's trying to take something from you and they're even going to a higher authority to do that, he's saying, what if you said okay? What if you were so committed to being a non-combatant, to not engaging with these people in this way? What if you were willing to say, take it. Take it. Hey, take more if you need. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This is a reference to an actual Roman custom or law where Roman soldiers were allowed to grab a passerby and make them carry their pack for a mile. So when he's saying this, that go the extra mile kind of thing is literally applied to a situation where any of these people in Jesus' audience could have been in that very situation, where one of these soldiers from their occupying power could come and say, I've got a bag full of weapons and armor and gold because I'm fabulously rich and you're poor and I want you to carry it for me, which would be not only that is not what you want to do, but how galling would it be to have to carry all of the equipment and whatever of the people who are oppressing you? That goes beyond just an inconvenience, and now this is an affront. And Jesus says, okay, carry it. Tell him you'll carry it another mile. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now we're not talking about anybody doing wrong. We're not talking about an oppressive system or a wicked person. Now, Jesus is just talking about the people in your life who you encounter that might need some help. Okay, and if he's already said, look, with these other things, a system that's holding you down, people that want to do you wrong, if I'm telling you that my way is a way of grace and compassion and love for even those people, well then what about the regular people in your life who just need some help? Of course, help them. Help them, because my way is a way of grace and compassion. But it's based on Christ himself. Our identity and our willingness to be like Jesus, you can't be like Jesus if he didn't model that for you in the first place. So for one thing, he's not asking any of us or any people in his audience, and he's not asking them to do anything that he wasn't also willing to do and went even further than that by dying on the cross for our sins. So he's saying, be like me. My way is for you to copy me, be like me, and show people that you represent this other kingdom, this other way of life. Your identity isn't rooted in your what you believe to be your rights or your comfort or your possessions. Your identity is found in me, and my way is a way of radical love and compassion and forgiveness and humility that can be mistaken for weakness. But it's powered by that love and the identity of Jesus. One thing that this kind of made me think of, and this is an example that is actually quite far removed from, I think, the actual life of Jesus. But I was thinking about Che Guevara, who was, he associated himself with Fidel Castro and the Cuban kind of revolution of the 50s and 60s. He was originally Argentinian, but here's a guy who, for one thing, started out as a doctor and then ended up part of this revolution along with Fidel Castro, responsible for the deaths of a lot of people, not necessarily following the first do no harm kind of doctor code, but he was I don't want to have too hot a take, but maybe bad guy, not a great guy. And I think it's funny, a lot of people know him now from do you remember a couple of years ago when it seemed like a lot of T-shirts were just covered in his image, the hat and the hair and the beard, and he looked kind of like a lion, and he looked awesome. Also killed a lot of people, so let's remember that. So when he was finally caught by another like Latin American government, he was going to be executed for all of the things he had done. And the government had picked a soldier to come and kill him. And when this guy showed up to kill Guevara, he was, I guess experiencing maybe some, doubt or like, I don't know if I want to do this. This is how do I go about executing this guy? And so then you get to Guevara's last words, which I find really fascinating because, and this might not be, complete fact. There might be something about this. This is a little apocryphal. But he supposedly looked at the guy who was about to execute him and said, "Go ahead and shoot, coward. You're only killing a man." And I was like, whoa, that is a really gutsy thing to say, like in the face of certain death, and you are now like accountable for what you've done, you're gonna receive your punishment, and to still be so confident and defiant. I find that incredible. Not necessarily what I think everybody needs to model, especially not what led him to that point. But the strength of his conviction and the fact that he was willing to say, yeah, go ahead and shoot. You're only killing a man. He was communicating that the thing he believed in was bigger than him. And he knew that he represented something that couldn't be stopped by a bullet. And I think that is the strength of what Jesus is saying. But instead of just being defiant in the face of, people holding you accountable for your crimes, what Jesus is saying is like, if somebody wants to take your stuff, if the best way to show them the life of my kingdom and the identity you have in me, if the best way to demonstrate that is for you to give up your stuff, then do it. Go ahead and take my stuff. You're only taking things. You think that you're going to be able to overpower me or get me under your thumb or whatever by hitting me? Go ahead and hit me. You're only hitting this person. But what I believe in, what I follow, the kingdom I'm a part of, can't be struck down, can't be stolen from. You can't sue it. So there is a strength and a kind of holy defiance of the status quo where might equals right, where you are saying, if you think what's going to accomplish your goals of power and authority and subjugating other people is to hurt me, okay, go ahead. But the God I follow, the way of life that I identify with, can't be stopped by any of these means. It communicates this strength that's powered by the love of Christ, powered by the life of Christ. You are making manifest in those situations the life of Christ in you. By saying, I don't need to demonstrate my power, my strength by asserting my will in this situation, by showing people that they can't get the better of me, by showing them that I am not weak and I am not small. You can't take advantage of me. Jesus is saying, what if they do? What if they do? Does that change the kingdom that you've aligned yourself with? Does that change your identity in me? Does that change the life that I will put in you and make shine through you? If anything, that kind of radical love and compassion and humility will only highlight that life and that kingdom and that identity. There's a movie I really, really like. It came out a few years ago. It's called Punch Drunk Love. It stars Adam Sandler in like his first dramatic role as just a guy who falls in love with somebody and then has some like conflict along the way. It's the plot is not very different than anything you might have seen before. But there's a moment where he gets in trouble with some people who are trying to blackmail him. And they are trying to escalate this situation where he will pay them money. And in doing so, they actually end up hurting the woman that he's fallen in love with. He gets in a car accident because of them, and she's injured. And he goes and confronts the person who's trying to blackmail him. And it's this amazing scene where through most of the movie, he's been this mild, kind of nervous guy. And when he finally confronts this person, he doesn't just threaten them or anything like that. What he says is, he stands right up in this guy's face and says, I've got strength in me that you wouldn't believe. There's a love in my life, and it makes me stronger than anything you can imagine. And I love the idea that this confrontation isn't him showing up and just fighting, and there's not a big action scene or anything. It's him saying, I feel powered by this love that's in my life, and it is giving me strength that you wouldn't understand. And to me, that is the message of these verses. Not that Jesus is saying, let people take advantage of you. Be weak. Don't ever stand up for anything or resist anyone at any point. Just, let it happen to you. But what he's saying is, situation by situation, are you willing to look at this? And when what you want to do is retaliate, when you want to do is assert yourself and your will and be aggressive and show people that you're not weak, he's saying, what if instead you look to me, you look at this way of life that I represent, the identity that you have in me, and let yourself be filled with the strength of my love that can enable you to be radically compassionate, unimaginably loving and gracious, to show people that the way of Christ is a way of aggressive peace. I don't know what that looks like for all of us here because these situations are very different. Each of our situations are different from each other, and they're different from what's being talked about in this verse. I don't know what it means for us exactly, all of us here, to have this soldier come and say, take my stuff for a mile. And you say, I'll take it for 2. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think what God is asking us to do, what I'm confident that he's asking me to do, is when conflict arises, which it will inevitably, probably every day, there is something that is going to happen to me, to you, every day where we say, I need to assert my will in this situation. My identity is one that cannot be associated with weakness. And when those times come up, he's saying, let your identity be found in me, and ask me how you can make that life of Christ manifest in this moment right now. And when you do that, see if the answer you get is strength and power and aggression, or if it is strength through love and compassion and forgiveness. So let me ask the worship team to come back up, and I'm gonna close in prayer and really ask the Lord that he might speak to us in these situations, that we might know how to clearly walk in that path of Christ. God, thank you for this day, this time together, and thank you for your word, and especially when we find these passages that are challenging and that are confusing or uncomfortable. Lord, I don't know how each of us is going to wrestle with these things and what you might speak to each of us, but God, I so appreciate that I find things in your word that I don't immediately understand. When it comes down to it, I don't want to follow a God who would react to every situation the way I would react. Where every bit of advice, every instruction, I look at it and go, yeah, that's exactly right. Because when that happens, I think maybe I'm not hearing you clearly. Lord, you are a God who is different than us, but who is, through Christ, giving us the ability to be more like you. And I pray that we would wrestle with these things and that you would show us the path of life, the path of Christ, the way to tell people that we identify with a different kingdom, a different structure of power that allows us, that encourages us to be radically loving and compassionate and forgiving, and that we might change lives around us. We might change the world around us because of that compassion that seems strange and that might look weak. but is powered by the strength of your love and your life. God, help us to remember to seek your face and not rely on what seems natural and comfortable to us. And when we do, I pray that you might just speak clearly and that we would know how to walk in the path of your Son. I pray these things in his name. Amen.